Chapter 16, Soul and Body in Process of Separation. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. St. Paul. The next day found me so weak and weary that I mentally protested against the least exertion, even the bath, my one diversion, but the echo that came back, "I will be faithful," compelled my compliance according to my promise. I protested in a subconscious way, just as I did about breathing or any other exertion, voluntary or involuntary. I was tired of it all, the endless tragedy of it. As I went into the bathroom I stopped and leaned against the door facing to rest and almost succumbed to the temptation to turn back to the bed, regardless of the invisible world and its requirements. Again, I seemed to hear myself saying, "I will be faithful," which spurred me on until I stood beside the tub. With one foot poised in midair I stood transfixed, looking with wide, amazed eyes at myself stretched full length in the tub. My foot slowly descended to the floor as a sensation of awe came upon me. There was no mistaking it, there I lay, there I stood, one eye gazing at the other. Common courtesy, not to mention physical impossibilities, forbade me joining my other self in the bath, beside which I did not care to annihilate that other self, without giving it an opportunity of explaining why I had waited so late in life to become twins. While watching it eagerly it began evidencing life, vibrating, splashing about as though in reality taking a bath. The thing was awesome and I trembled somewhat as I looked at it. It was certainly me and there I stood looking at it, watching it manifest life, and acting as I would act. Then almost suddenly it became dual as it struggled in the water. Distinctly I could see another body, shadowy but defined, an exact duplicate, confined within the physical body, the duplicate as distinctly discernible as the original. This body interpenetrated the physical, the relation of the physical body to it being very much that of a glove covering the hand, the inner body directing the movements of the outer body as the hand directs the glove. At first the duplicate or shadow body used its potency in regulating the movements of the physical body, then it seemed to withdraw within itself, letting go of the physical body, as it were, which became heavily still. Independently of the outer, the inner body began slightly vibrating, more and more pronouncedly and with ever-increasing power. In the exercise of its movements, now unhampered by the physical, it began pulling up the feet with that peculiar vibratory motion so characteristic of these manifestations and continued, pulling until the shadow feet came up to about midway between the knees and ankles only to fall back and vibrate up again and again. Then the shadow hands began jerking and pulling themselves up, loosening them, as it were, from the physical hands that lay still and motionless. They did not succeed so well as the feet, with the greatest apparent effort they could come no higher than just about the wrists. Then the shadow hands and feet began working at the same time and the entire inner body moved in apparent readjustment, the hands and feet repeatedly pulling up to what seemed their limit only to fall back and start all over again while the physical body lay white and still in the water. It is impossible to conceive of how fascinating and awe-inspiring this phenomenon was. It held me oblivious to all things else. It was evident that the spirit or soul body was trying to force itself out of the physical, trying to gain strength by drawing up the hands and feet to propel it in an upward direction beyond the physical confines. The shadow head was pressing hard against the cranium, but never one time did it go for even the faintest fraction beyond. The shadow eyes pulled away from their physical windows, the nose and ears drew away, but the mouth remained firm. I realized that I was being shown the modus operandi of the separation of the soul from the body, and truly, it was a gruesomely wonderful thing to look upon. So engrossed was I in its contemplation that I took no note of time, and just when it promised a revelation of the exit, a voice so startled me I nearly jumped into the tub amid the strange, weird dissection.
"You have been in here quite long enough."
And punctuating her words with her presence, the nurse stood looking at me, her face mirroring her surprise and annoyance to find I had not even been in the water. Suppressing her annoyance she said, with forced solicitude,
"How stupid of me to permit you to remain so long. Come into bed at once."
So saying she took my cold hand and half leaning on her I went into bed with a heart heavy with disappointment, feeling that but for ill-timed interruption, my eyes would have feasted upon the mystery of mysteries, the goodbye scene between the soul and its earth abode. With half-closed eyes, I listened without hearing her lecture on taking the proper care of oneself. Then I heard her go into the bathroom and turn out the water, wondering vaguely if the apparition was still there, yet realizing that even if it were the power to see, it was not hers. Strange that one person can see such things and another cannot. Yet such is a truth that can be demonstrated. When she came in, she brought some wine and tried to cheer me, but my disappointment was too poignant to be dissipated by mere wine and words, especially as her promises were for physical betterment, of which I never expected to avail myself. For death seemed in a measure to have already foreclosed its mortgage on me. What I had seen haunted me. It seemed my mind had photographed it. Wherever I looked, I seemed to see that weird, struggling spirit in its desperate efforts to escape from the prison house of flesh in which it was incarcerated. Shutting my eyes did not shut it out, but rather intensified it. In fancy, I almost felt a shadow body struggling within me. I knew it must be there, but was it really struggling to escape? I was sure it was, but why did it struggle when I was so willing that it should escape? I think there must have been something of exultation in the knowledge that now I could answer that oft-repeated question, where is the soul? To which everybody seems to have some kind of answer, theory, or conjecture, but which inevitably reverts to the agnostic admission, I do not know. And now I did know, and the knowledge was wonderfully uplifting spiritually. This relationship of soul and body can be likened unto the interpenetration of water poured on sand. The water sinks into the earth, fertilizes, gives it life and the ability to reproduce, and yet it is not visible to the physical eye any more than is the soul in the human earth. Water is the soul of Mother Earth, spirit the soul of human earth. Water goes back from whence it came, so does the spirit, each in its own way, by its own process. When night and the magic of its stillness was upon everything, it all came back, and the shadow of body within was calling to other shadows that had been released from their prisons of flesh, and they came renewing the promise of my release, and we all rejoiced together. My body had become a thing apart, and I no longer included it in thought of myself. It was now a useless thing from which I would soon escape. Then, in a sense of humility, I wondered why this wonderful experience, this knowledge, had been given to me instead of one more spiritually worthy, to one of the many who have spent their lives in an effort to solve this great problem. The more I thought of it, the more the responsibility of the knowledge weighed upon me. I could not feel that I was entitled to it, and my mood grew retrospective. As I meditated, out of the files of memory came a little song, which as a child, I sang in Sunday school long ago, entitled, "Pass It On," and insinuated itself into the thread of my thoughts as though it belonged there, and in the long silent watches of the night every word came back, tramping through the halls of consciousness as though it were a thing of today instead of belonging to the yesterdays of childhood. It made me feel that I wanted to tell the whole world what I knew and what I had seen, and in reality, pass it on, even unto the ends of the world, and I felt the thrill of such a possibility. And as the dream pages turned backward, I was a child again, time had given back its toll. I could hear the old organ pealing forth its melody in the little church nestling among the cool, green trees, saw the flowers and half-dilapidated grounds, the solemn gravestones, sentinels of the dead, in the distance as I looked out of the window. In the Sunday school choir with me were the same little girls with their fluffy skirts and curly hair, the same little boys with hair wet and plastered down, fumbling nervously with catechisms, stealing glances at the lessons which they had not looked at until they came. There were the same teachers with benign and kindly faces, the same organist, and we were standing about her as she played, all singing. Have you had a kindness shown? Pass it on, pass it on. 'Twas not given for you alone. Pass it on, pass it on. Let it travel down the years. Let it wipe another's tears, till in heaven the deed appears. Pass it on. Pass it on. And thus with the present and past intermingling, half dreaming, half waking, sleep, nature's soft nurse, touched me with her tender unconsciousness, and I did not wake until the day had come. That day when I went to the bath I looked eagerly, hoping that I might again see that which had so engrossed my thoughts since its appearance the day before. But it was ever so, when I expected or looked for such things they came not, but waited until I was entirely off guard, to confront me with the most unexpected and inconceivable phenomena. With disappointment I resigned myself to the most uneventful bath of the series. I could not even feel a presence near, listened but no voice came, no hands touched me. The invisible world seemed suddenly depopulated. A chilly depression made the bath as short as it was uneventful, and I returned to bed with a loneliness so intense it was painful. This sudden withdrawal of the supermundane from the mundane life produces the most oppressive loneliness imaginable. However, loneliness of any kind was a new sensation to me, for my invariable answer when anyone asks me if I am ever lonely is a yes, sometimes, for my own company, to be alone with myself. This strikes a responsive chord in some hearts, but most admit their dependence for companionship on their fellow creatures. And now I was lonely, really bitterly lonely, my soul was crying out for companionship. How had I offended my friends of the world invisible that they had withdrawn so entirely? "Come back to me," I whispered pleadingly, "come back, I am so lonely without you," but they heeded me not, and with a heavy heart, I turned my eyes to the nurse, a mundane creature, for companionship and consolation. Noting the unhappiness in my face, she was quick to respond and came to me, asking kindly,
"What is it, dear?"
"Oh, nothing, nothing. I am so tired, tired of being sick," I made answer as a downpour of tears relieved the tenseness. She answered with conventional words of consolation.
There, don't cry, you will be well in a few days. You are so much better already."
I did not reply, knowing well enough that I was neither better nor worse, but in the same negative condition that I had been for days, being held there by a force desiring it and having the ability to enforce it. I felt this force and recognized it, yet was compelled to take pills and medicines until the sight and effect of them almost made me really ill. For the nurse, having a professional sense of duty, never let a period which demanded these inflictions pass without exercising her prerogative. I submitted as uncomplainingly as possible. But this day my enforced loneliness made me feel more kindly toward her than I had done before, and I entered into a conversation with her that helped fill an otherwise lonely afternoon, and found her more intellectual than I had hoped for. But it was when the shadow of earth called night came down, shutting out the light of day, that the flood tide of loneliness penetrated my being. It was then I called again and again, "Come," it was then my eyes searched eagerly for a sign, then that I listened anxiously for even a whisper or a tapping, listened until hope turned ashes and weariness sifted its torturing despair into my soul. I felt like holding up my hands in the darkness that pressed upon me and calling aloud to those hidden behind it to come to me again, to speak to me, but the shadows flickering past only mocked me. Assuming shapes roused my hopes until the dawn came dispelling them entirely. Nor did the day bring their return, noon gave way to afternoon with their desertion still preying upon me. I wondered how I had offended, whether I had failed in my promised faithfulness. Out of the stillness these words came back to haunt me, "O weaver of thy freedom, be faithful." I seemed to hear them again and felt as though I had not been as faithful as I might have been, nor did I try to justify myself. I was only sorry with a desire to make amends, yet feeling that it was too late. A vague sense of the end was upon me, and with an aching heart I waited. The afternoon was well spent, when the nurse, noting that my usual bathing hour had passed, asked,
"Aren't you going to bathe today?"
"Yes, but don't turn on the water, I'll just take a shower." And again the temptation not to bathe assailed me as I felt really unequal to it in every way. Then I reasoned that absence of him to whom I had made the promise did not absolve me from it, and I felt ashamed for almost yielding to the temptation, feeling that if I could not keep my promises when left alone, my faithfulness was indeed a cheap commodity. Then I resolved to be truly faithful in every promise regardless of everything. With this determination full upon me, I went into the bath and turned on the water, which came with a hard, cold impact that was almost painful. Wondering at this, I reduced the supply, but it came so insufficiently that I turned it on full again, but it spurted upon me with such chilling impact that I decided, shivering, to conclude the bath, when I noted the usual appearance of the water. It was clear and sparkling, falling in ice-like formations over my body, piling up in some places, and melting as it came in contact with my warm skin. I looked at it and examined it analytically, and if it wasn't ice, I never saw any. While realizing how preposterous this sounds, I took it in my hand and held it between my fingers. It melted and I shivered with the coldness of it. I held the hose high over my head, permitting these crystalline formations to fall over my hair and roll on my body in their cold, transparent beauty while I wondered at it. Suddenly the whole room seemed turned into a veritable crystal palace, catching and radiating all colors, soft, glistening white predominating, and still the formations fell upon me, some melting in my hair, others rolling about in icy indiscrimination, just a page from the book of fairy dreams. Then a change came over everything, the room seemed to merge into something else, the hose had fallen from my hand, beings of the invisible, cloud-robed and frostily white floated about, while the choir invisible added its harmony. Rainbows and crystals seemed intermingling in the radiant whiteness, and I felt as one with the pure creatures that hovered about. As the shadow body within me, in independence of the physical environment, felt stronger and more defined as a separate entity in its association with what it recognized as creatures of its kind, free from the restraint of the material. Above all was a sense of something too great to be measured, something which to describe would be to degrade. Infinitude interpenetrated all, including me. So far had I drifted out beyond the portals of the mundane that the sound of the nurse's voice was like an explosion of dynamite, as she said decisively.
Time is up. You are not strong enough to stay in long today.
And thus from above the clouds, wrapped within the meshes of its misty veil, I fell suddenly into a cold bathtub, with the nurse bending over me with anxiety in her face. Chapter 17, Gethsemane. The broad-minded see the truth in different religions, the narrow-minded see only the differences. After my nurse assisted me into bed, she remarked with emphasis.
You are not able to take these baths, and I shall insist that the doctor have them discontinued.
When I was about to remonstrate, a voice whispered.
No more are necessary.
And accordingly, I responded submissively. I shall take no more. Evidently pleased at what she considered an easy victory, the nurse added.
You may take them when you are better, but not while you are so weak.
She chafed my cold hands between her warm palms, which burned almost painfully. Then pulling the light covers more snugly about me, she gave me a glass of port, which I drank to the last drop, enjoying its life-giving glow.
Try to rest now,
she said kindly, as she went to the south window and picked up a magazine, leaving me to the joyous realization that, if my soul had been stained in the past on its terrestrial journey, my naturalization with the ethereal forces had beautifully demonstrated that it was no longer so, and had left no doubt as to my oneness with them. And now, I told myself, I am ready for the transition. In profound humility, I thanked whatever it was that had tortured me with waiting and preparations, at which I had so often rebelled, and felt completely compensated by this one manifestation. Even now I look back on that bath as too sacred to describe in a book, the very nature of which is bound to excite differences of opinion, even in the sympathetic, to say nothing of the criticisms of those who cannot understand and the jestings of those who will not. The last-class Schopenhauer must have had in mind when he said, naked truth is out of place before the eyes of the profane vulgar. It can only make its appearance thickly veiled. It is easier for me to understand those who refuse to believe anything, than those who believe everything blindly. To me, knowledge and faith are synonymous. I believe in knowing for oneself. All else is a matter of belief. While I know that what I am recording in these pages is true, I do not expect my readers to accept my mere statement. I do hope, however, that this book will impel its readers to investigate for themselves individually. The soul's relation to the invisible world is not a matter of belief, it is a matter of knowledge. One either knows or does not know. A wider or more fascinating field of research does not exist, but each person must search for himself. The gate is open to all, we can enter or not just as we will. He who thinks with the many must often think wrong, so Shakespeare tells us, and so history proves. There was a time when the many believed the world had four corners and the sun moved instead of the earth, but this did not make the earth square, nor the sun move. When Columbus announced his intention of going in search of another world, which he believed beyond the seas, only a few shared his belief, while the many not only doubted and scoffed, but denounced him as mad. Fortunately, the existence of the Western Hemisphere did not depend on whether the many believed in it or not. There is always a Columbus who insists on seeing for himself and thereby is convinced, thus helping the world in its evolution towards perfection. Just as surely as there is a world beyond the sea of water, there is one beyond the sea of silence. The space world, like the sea, has its inhabitants. Looking casually, you cannot discover this, but when once upon it, the evidence of life appears. The sea has laws that must be complied with before we can become intimate with its creatures. Calling a fish will not bring him, but a hook and line will. There is no doubt that at one time people, except those few living where the tides brought them in, did not know what the inhabitants of the sea were like. Most people do not know what the inhabitants of space are like, except the few whose consciousness is touched by the tides of other shores, and there are more of these than is generally supposed. The standing army of cowards that public opinion makes has within its ranks those who could tell truths stranger than any fiction ever written, but dare not for fear of what people might think or say. Vanity intrudes itself even at death. As I lay with eyes closed dreaming of the long-delayed transition, which I felt was near realization, my mind wandered to a pearl-bedecked dress, pure and white, and before my mind's eyes there was materialized a beautiful corpse, robed in magnificent garments, which had been created for a bride, to whom every pearl, every thread had represented joyous anticipation of love's consummation. There was something fascinating about the picture, even in the contemplated arrangement of the hair, the manicuring of the nails, etc. So enamored did I become of robing my corpse in my wedding dress, that I wanted to look into a mirror and see whether this enforced illness had left any traces on my face. As apprehensively I wondered whether the long agonizing weeks had written their story in lines on my face. Although I realized this was foolish, it was irresistible, and I felt compelled to see how I looked. I knew that I should be thinking of higher things and, though I resisted the impulse as long as I could, I was finally obliged to call the nurse and ask, "Will you please bring me a mirror? I want to see how I look."
Very well.
She assented smiling, as she turned away to comply with my request, and in a moment returned, handing me the glass, saying,
Your illness has certainly dealt gently with your looks.
I accepted her remark only as an encouragement and, when she resumed her seat by the window, I held the mirror in my hand hesitating to look, because I thought it possible that my appearance had changed. After pausing a little I looked. Uncertainty deepened into profound interest as I stared into the mirror. Not a line of my face nor the semblance of it did I see. Instead of the reflection of my face, there was something alarmingly different, a garden in which the form of a man was kneeling with eyes upturned in reverential entreaty. It needed no one to tell me what this represented, yet I was reluctant to admit it, and tried further to deceive myself by wondering what it meant, refusing to accept what I knew it was and what everyone would recognize. I had, perforce, one might say, within the last few weeks accepted God, a supreme being, infinite intelligence, call it what you will, the cause of which the earth life is the effect, but to accept the Christ seemed different, and yet there before my eyes was reflected in minute detail, as the orthodox would conceive it, the sublime agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. It distressed me to behold this scene, I who at the same time was denying it and looking at it. I did not want to see it nor admit its existence. I had progressed so wonderfully near the world beyond that, encountering this vision on the threshold of it, was like a bar to further progress. It was as if my greatest sin of omission had waited to halt me at the very gateway. No, not that, it cannot be, I told myself, as with a sigh of unrest I laid the glass face down on the bed and tried to convince myself that it was all a delusion, that my sight had become impaired by constantly seeing things that did not exist to the physical senses. And then, what had the story of this garden to do with me anyway? I knew there was an existence beyond this, into which one passed through the process we call a death, but this did not compel the acceptance of all the theories of all the ages. I argued to myself that this Christ was only one of many Christs, recalling the beautiful story of Lord Buddha and the saviors of other nations. Along these lines my thoughts wandered, from the vision in the mirror, into the realm of stock arguments against the Christ, which so fortified me mentally that I was quite confident that the vision had vanished, and, with this assurance, I raised the mirror and again looked into it. I almost dropped it, so great was the shock. It was nearer, much nearer, and wonderfully magnified. I never looked upon anything that so affected me, especially so when I perceived that the figure in the garden was alive. As I looked fixedly at it, the hands, moved in supplication, the eyes tremblingly opened and shut in agony, and a great scintillating light came down above the head and played about the sorrowful face, while the lips quivered, the eyelids stiffened, and the eyes grew fixed in upward supplication. I realized that this was the most wonderful scene that I had had the privilege of beholding. The hand of time had turned back to the tragedy of tragedies and bringing it up through the centuries, had placed it before my unbelieving eyes and I gazed at it in the very agony of its reality. Yes, there was the Garden of Gethsemane lay across my pathway, between me and the other world, and to go beyond it was to pass through it. And the living scene held me as in a spell. I could not turn my eyes away, it held me in an awe that was painfully fascinating, and a voice was whispering sorrowfully, Gethsemane, Gethsemane, and soft voices took up the refrain farther and farther away until the very faintest echo came back, Gethsemane, Gethsemane. I then found myself staring in the mirror at the reflection of my own pale, disturbed face, to which I did not even notice, for I realized the wonderful vision had gone. I laid the mirror down reverently, face up, and thought long and earnestly. All noises seemed sacrilegious. I remember these words insinuated themselves into my thoughts. The same world still whether it smiles or scorns. That crowned Voltaire with roses, Christ with thorns. The vision seemed indelible. It was photographed on my mentality and impressed upon my soul. I sought to fathom the mystery of it. A voice startled me saying,
We are all Christ's, the same divine spark is incorporated within all. He is the Son of God, and all are the children of God.
How shocking this sounded for a moment, but the still, small voice within, the divine spark, whispered, and I knew it was true.
He is the perfect man manifested, our exemplar and teacher.
Continued the speaker.
When we evolve to where we are willing to die that others might live, we begin to recognize within ourselves the Christ consciousness.
There was such a sense of being lifted up above and beyond the mundane, a sense of no longer belonging to the earth life, that when dinner was served it seemed an unnatural thing, a thing to be resented. How could one administer to the physical, when the banquet halls of the soul were filled with feasts that money could not buy, nor earth produce? And I feel the power uprising. Like the power of an embryo god. With a glorious wall it surrounds me. And lifts me up from the sod. In the stillness of the night, these manifestations of the day came back persistently, and reenacted themselves, driving sleep away. I tried to shut them out, by listening attentively to the heavy dashing of the sea against the riprap beyond the seawall, and endeavored to fancy myself watching the spray, as it splashed above the rocks and fell back in the foam of the sea. But above all there was a garden scene that haunted my senses, the face of the man of sorrows shut out everything else. There was an invisible throng about me. I could hear them talking amongst themselves as in consultation and hear that compelling word, Gethsemane. Then magically a change came over everything and I stood in the garden where I had seen the figure of sorrow kneeling. I realized that standing there was a privilege that transcends conception. And even as this recognition was upon me, I found that I was not alone. In some strange way this garden seemed to embrace the whole world and the whole world was sorrowing deeply, and, the voice that was calmer than the silence, said,
When I come again, I will destroy this garden of sorrows.
Was it Christ telling me that he was coming again? I was asking myself in perplexity not unmixed with humility, as I looked pityingly upon the sorrow about me and then lifted my eyes beyond it to the other side, and, although the garden was dark but for the stars, beyond it there was a beacon light, illuminating the dark, silent waters beyond, to which the path through the garden led. We may not know it but there lies, somewhere under the evening skies, a garden we all must see. Gethsemane, Gethsemane. Each his own Gethsemane.